Thank you for joining us today. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement before we start our time together. While we meet here on a virtual platform, we should take a moment to recognize the importance of the land on which we are located. We acknowledge the territory to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. Here in Moncton, New Brunswick, I live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik peoples and the Mi'kmaq peoples, and I invite you to learn more about the territory on which you reside. Throughout, the way that this presentation is going to work is we will have each presenter share their papers with us for 20 minutes each, and we'll save the questions at the end of their presentation, so approximately 30 minutes for questions at the end. You can communicate during the webinar through the chat function in Zoom, but only the panelists can view your comments. You can also, but we ask for your questions to put those in the Q&A section. So you'll see that at the bottom of your screen. If you just hover there, it will show up and you can see the Q&A. So questions specific to the presentations, we ask that you put those in the Q&A. You can also activate closed captioning if you need it. Again, that is at the bottom panel. My name is Kathleen Hillier, and I will be hosting today's webinar. I'd like to thank Sherry Fox from the Canadian Sociological Association for organizing all the logistics of our webinars this year. And this one today is actually our last webinar for this academic year, and we are hoping to continue them on next year. I'd also like to thank my co-chair of the Canadian Sociological Association Sociology of Education Research Cluster, Dr. Alana Butler, and the president of the Canadian Association of Sociology of Education, Dr. Isul Yoon. It has been an honor working with all of you in organizing these webinars this year. Today we have two presentations, and I welcome our two presenters, Dr. Ardith McGeown Plant and Dr. Paul Bennett. Each presenter, as I mentioned, will share their presentations with us, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end. So I welcome first Dr. Ardith McGeown Plant to present her research on the effects of parental and societal demands on the provincial government to enact compulsory education laws in Manitoba.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hillier, for that introduction. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. As well, I want to take the opportunity just before I begin today to thank both the CSE and the CSSE for providing me with the opportunity to present my research findings today. And I didn't realize that we were the last webinar of the academic year, but hopefully I can, no pressure at all, sum that up with some of my findings, and I hope you find them as interesting as I do, as well as hopefully some further opportunity for reflection and some questions as well. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen, and as Dr. Hillier said, I'm going to be presenting for the next 20 minutes, looking at the importance of compulsory school laws, as well as the related aspect of student attendance, specifically in the province of Manitoba. So here we go. So here's my presentation, and as I said, I'm going to be looking at some of the sort of influences, as it says, on the provincial government to enact compulsory school laws in the province of Manitoba. And you have my name there, and I'm going to be sharing with you my contact information at the end of my presentation today. So I wanted to begin with a question. And I guess, as they say, inquiring minds like to know. So I'd like to begin with a question asking, do I have to go to school today? And if you have young children, or even yourself, when you were a young child, and if you ask that question to your parents, I know myself many times when I was younger, I would ask my mom the question. I'd get up every morning and I'd say, "Do I have to go to school today, Mom?" And she would say yes. And then she would just say, "Yes, you better get ready and go." But she didn't really tell me why I had to go. So my question is really, well, why do we have to go to school? What is it that requires us as students in the K-12 system, specifically across Canada and all the different jurisdictions? Why do we have to attend school? Now, I'm kind of looking at to see if anybody has any answers to that question before I continue. But the answer I'm going to say to you right now is, well, predominantly it's the law, right? And I don't think that traditionally that many of our parents sort of said that to us when we were young. We just kind of said, well, you have to go, so you better go. But it really is about the law. But here's the interesting aspects. But there are a lot of other influences that certainly, as I said here, predicated the onset on compulsory school in Canada. And specifically for our purposes in today's presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the province of Manitoba. As we know, education is a provincial jurisdiction as set out in the British North America Act of 1867. So I only have about 20 minutes, so I can't really discuss all the different, acts across Canada. And my focus of my research is predominantly within the province of Manitoba, where I reside. I wanted to begin by, again, kind of going back a bit in history, if I may. I'm kind of a student of history, and I find it fascinating to really explore some of the aspects and the importance of history, particularly as it has affected and influenced education throughout the years. So to begin, I wanted to share this picture with you. And this is a actual picture of a one-room schoolhouse in rural Manitoba about 100 years ago. And it's interesting when we look at a school like this, because certainly you can see, if you kind of sort of note, there's a bell on top of the building, right? Which, of course, the ringing of the school bell indicates to all of us that, we have to go to school. That's when the school day starts, as well as I'm sure many of us are looking forward to as well. When the bell rung at the end of the day, that also indicated the end of the school day. But for purposes today, we're going to talk about the actual aspect of beginning school. So when that bell rings, we actually have to be in attendance at that school. So as I said, I'm going to be looking at the importance of that, specifically looking at the education laws in the province of Manitoba, but also, as my research has also noted, there were many other influences beside the government that certainly impacted the development and the continual, actually, sort of development of compulsory schooling within this province. So I'm going to be speaking to the aspects of society, different societal pressures, parental influences, as well as the role of business and industry. But to begin, I just want to share with you a few terms, if I may. Of course, when we're looking at educational law and educational statutes, similar to other educational other laws, it's important to note some of the different sort of clauses or section of those laws and the relevance for them. So if I may draw your attention to a few of these, I'm going to be speaking to this aspect of, the right to attend school, the compulsory age to attend school, compulsory school entrance age, compulsory school leaving age. I think there's a little bit of a trend there, if you note that. Also in terms of truancy, right? And for purposes today, I'm going to be defining truancy from the Oxford Dictionary as of the action of staying away from school without good reason, right? Or absenteeism. And I'm also going to borrow, if I may, from Mr. Coldwell, and you can see the quote just there, who was the former Minister of Education in 1915 in the province of Manitoba. And what he suggested was compulsory school attendance and truancy provisions are really synonymous. They mean exactly the same thing. But further to that, I also want to kind of begin my discussion with a quotation from the editor of the Winnipeg Free Press from 1910. And what he said, and I would suggest to you it still rings true today, two things were necessary. The first was to get the children to school, and the second was to get them there as regularly as possible. And that's the challenge that still exists today, 122 years later. So If I can, I'm going to take you back a little bit farther than even 1910. Okay? And I'm going to go way back to the Greeks, which is over 2,000 years ago. And I promise not to stick in the past too much. But certainly we can see this great debate, as I call it, between the right to an education, as you can see with certain sections of this education law, compared to this importance of a public purpose. This is something that's been debated, as I said, for over 2,000 years. And we can see when even going back and looking at Plato's writings through the Republic, the three major questions that he posed. And what he says is this, I'm just going to share this with you for a second. It's not clear that the elders should be governed and the younger should be governed. And it's not plain that the best of them should govern. If our guardians become the best educated, will they not be the most vigilant over the safety of our society? And I think these three questions still should permeate many of our discussions today. What is the purpose of education? What is the purpose of making education compulsory? Now, sorry about that. One other aspect I wanted to also speak to was this aspect, as I said, of student attendance. Now, Wallner wrote a book, a Canadian author and a Canadian professor here. And one of the things that she suggested was that it's also important to note not just this aspect of educational law or statutes, but the related aspect of local taxation or educational finance. And many people would think when we're talking about education, certainly finance is a very important point, but how does that affect student attendance? And what she suggests in her discussion here from 2014 in her book, Learning to School, is that she looks at this aspect of local taxation. For example, what she says in that first quotation I have there is, local tax assessment will encourage parents to send their children to school as well as to stabilize school finance. And I think that's a really important element to draw out. And further, in the second quotation, she suggests that universal property taxes would encourage parents to send their children to school, given that they were being forced to contribute regardless of attendance. So we can see that it's not just the educational laws that prescribed compulsory school attendance, but as well, when these different educational finance options were being presented over 100 years ago, and this was something that came from London, Ontario at that point, it was something that was also sort of a common practice and kind of spread throughout all the jurisdictions of Canada. The aspect and the importance of local taxation to hopefully foster and encourage student attendance, for children in schools. Now, sorry, one of the other aspects of this looks at the influence of society. And of course, through the writings of some of the major authors throughout time, such as John Dewey or Osborne, we can see this great debate continuing as well. So for example, what Dewey says is that the purpose of education has always been, right, to everyone in essence, the very same, right? To give the young the things they need in order to develop into a member of a society, right? To make a contribution to society. Now, what Osborne says is a little different. What he says is, well, jump forward about 80 years, and we can see the development of these ideas a bit further, moving slightly away from, again, what Plato has suggested, what even we were looking at in terms of trying to get students to attend school, but further to what Osborne suggested was that the purpose of education is not to confirm in us an existing version of identity or culture, but to try and help us step outside of that, to view it with a different perspective, and if I may, by paraphrasing, to enrich our experience, right, through choices, by the opportunity then of the individual to make a choice, not just feeling that they have this prescription, right, or mandate to fulfill as part of society. The one other point I wanted to mention to go back here, I think I missed this as well, but under the current thing with the Manitoba Public Schools Act, and this is something that has been on the books in Manitoba for over 100 years, is that and I would suggest to you that in many jurisdictions across Canada, other jurisdictions have a Public Schools Act or something that they call like that. And there are these two important distinctions that I want to pull to your attention today. One is the right to attend school. Okay, and this is a very important distinction that's made in these educational statutes, the right to attend. What that really sort of refers to is that I have the right to attend, to send my child to school. My child has the right to attend a public school within the K-12 system. And as it suggests here, and this is again from the Manitoba statute, it really looks at this aspect of a child who turns 6 in a given year can attend school anytime during that year until they graduate or until they receive a diploma or until they reach the age of 18. Or alternatively, they can also attend school to the age of 21 in the province of Manitoba. Now that's an important distinction. And now you compare that to what they say here about the compulsory age to attend school. So here, even though these two sections coexist almost one after the other within our educational statutes, you can see on one sort of perspective of this economy is this aspect of the right to attend. I can do this versus I must do this. And this is also an important distinction within the provincial legislation. So for example, what this clause suggests is that children are required to attend school from the time that they reach the compulsory school age of 7 years of age until December 31st of that year, until they attain the age of 18 or until they graduate. Now, I just want to make sort of a note here that in Manitoba specifically, at age of 7 was unique to the province of Manitoba until most recently. That age of 7 was just changed to 6 as of 2 years ago, right, to coincide with that right to attend school. But believe it or not, from 1916 until 2020, it was only required that I had to send my child to school when they turned 7. And again, the actual age of 18 was only revised 11 years ago in 2011. At that point, what existed on the books was that you only had to attend school until you were 16. So from the age of 7 to the age of 16, and that was from 1916 until they changed the compulsory school leaving ages in 2011 in Manitoba. And that's an important fact as well, because Manitoba became only the third jurisdiction in Canada at that point that increased the compulsory school leaving age until the age of 18, following New Brunswick as well as Ontario. Every other jurisdiction across Canada still has that compulsory age to leave school of either 16 or 17. So some kind of interesting sort of tidbits there and facts about the province of Manitoba. Now, another thing I wanted to mention was really what compulsory school legislation. Again, when I began my session here today, I asked that question: is do I have to go to school? You know, what's this really all about? And typically, people believe it's about the law, and that's partially correct. However, as I've noted here by a quote by Axelrod, what he suggests is, well, really compulsory school legislation always follows, right? It doesn't really lead, but it follows, right? Public policy in this sense, what he's suggesting is that is responsive to, right? It's not really proactive, it's responsive to different kind of large scale participation in public schooling. So I want to share with you, as I said, what history had shown us over the years, and also which partially supports his perspective. But as well, I also want to share with you some new and interesting legislation, as I suggested, that kind of give us some food for thought as well. So here we go. Here are some headlines, like I said, from Manitoba over 100 years ago. And I would like to suggest here that I had to, within my research, access archived newspaper articles, because up to 1958 in Manitoba, there are no formal record of debates or proceedings in our provincial legislature. There's no Hansard at all up till 1958. So basically from 1870, when Manitoba became a province, up till 1958, almost 100 years later, 88 years, is that there's no record. We don't really know what the debates were going on in our provincial legislature. So predominantly with when I was conducting my research, I had to draw upon, as I said here, some of the headlines, some of the articles from the newspapers at that point, which were both the Winnipeg Tribune and the Winnipeg Free Press. So for example, what we see here, and under this topic of compulsory education, one of the headlines is that Manitoba needs to have a proper law, right? Whatever that means. But that was certainly one of the debates that was being discussed within the context of the local newspapers at that point. Now, following that, in 1910, we see another article. Again, this time is from the Winnipeg Tribune, as you can see from the headline there, from March 9th of 1910. And really where it speaks about this aspect of the elevator question. And if you haven't heard about this before, it's kind of an interesting perspective. Compulsory school legislation, believe it or not, is really been deemed with an historical perspective of called the elevator question, right? And really what that means is that an elevator is used kind of as an example to examine compulsory schooling, particularly as the governments increase the school leaving age, right? Kind of like an elevator. Hopefully it's always keeps moving forward, kind of keep moving up, right? So that's why they present the aspect of compulsory education within this perspective of the elevator question. Now, further to that, there's some additional aspects that are noted. Looking at, as it says here, some other sort of headlines at that point, both from, again, 1910 and forward in the 1910s in Manitoba. You know, government was totally against compulsory education. They did not want to enact any type of legislation to mandate, attendance in schools at that point. And if you note the headline on the right-hand side, Mr. Coldwell, again, former Minister of Education at that point, says that that question is a dead letter in Canada and US, i.e. we're not going to look at it. It's not important. We're not going to touch that. Well, that's what he thought. Okay. However, what started to happen, what we really saw throughout the 1910s in Winnipeg predominantly, and even in Manitoba across the province at that time, was starting to see some changes both within, as I mentioned here, the rise of industry, right? People were moving into the city. Canada, Winnipeg in particular in the 1910s was considered to be the Chicago of the North. It was a very, in a sense, the metropolitan sort of center. And there was many changes in terms of a move from, of course, as we understand it, move from the sort of agrarian way of life coming into the cities at that point. And many authors have also noted this change in terms of the growth of industry and the implications for education to fulfill some of those perceived and needed gaps that industry required at that point. So just noting some of the research we can see here from Sheldon, what she suggests is, of course, is that really what was required was this better qualified workforce and ultimately to reduce employment, delinquency, and crime, along with, as it says here, as Hageman suggested, this investment in human capital, and it was indispensable, for economic development. And further, what Hogan suggested was that, well, really it's about what the parents wanted at that point to better their conditions for their children in the real world of the competitive marketplace. And then even if we spring forward to what Gorski said in his writings of 2012, education was perceived to be the great equalizer. So with that perspective, in 1914, another headline I want to share with you is this aspect that Mr. Coldwell, Minister of Education, as I said at that point, was really, really under a lot of pressure to enact this compulsory school legislation. And again, if we look at jurisdictions at that point across Canada, we did see, of course, Alberta, Ontario, and other jurisdictions and already enacted this compulsory legislation. So why did Manitoba? And this is why there was pressure at that point on the government to do something. Well, there's something really wasn't what everybody wanted. It was a tweak, if you want to look at it that way, to the current Children's Act of 1914. And really all this did actually was to add several little sections to this act regarding the aspect of, if you notice here, about juvenile delinquency, right? The aspect that no child should be forced to attend school unless they were considered to be, as is defined at that point in the Children's Act, a neglected child whose parents ignore their moral duties in raising him. And this is an actual line right from that act. And as it says here from Ardith, what he also tries to draw attention when discussing this particular statute is that really it was about this aspect of juvenile delinquency. And as it says here, under this particular law, these children who were truant, who were not attending school, were actually considered to be criminals under the law, which is quite serious, of course. So again, the idea of going back to that perspective of they were going to arrest these young offenders, they were going to put them in jail. So it's a very, very, very oppressive sort of perspective of the Children's Act, trying to respond to public and industry pressures to enact some type of a compulsory, school law. Now, finally, we can see that the tide starts to turn. The government, under such incredible pressure at that point, starts to realize, well, we got to do something, right? So what they decided to do was to eventually create the Student Attendance Act. And this is a really important distinction I wanted to draw everyone's attention to, because in the literature, in Manitoba, everybody believes that the actual compulsory schooling was actually mandated in 1914. But actually, that's not necessarily the case. I know I spent a whole summer in the legislative library in the basement of the archives here in Winnipeg, going through all these acts, and it's the actual formation and enactment of any type of Student Attendance Act was in 1916 with this actual thing, the Student Attendance Act. Here, though, we don't see what we had really anticipated. Certainly, as it says, it does make references to the aspect of child labor at that point, which again was quite rapid because of the development of industry and certainly young children in the workplace. However, it does establish what the public, what I think businesses were really looking at that point, was this aspect of you have to attend school at the age of 7, and you have to stay in school until you reach the age of 14. Now, jump forward then, if I can start bringing you up a little bit more to some of the current times, even though this is about 50 years ago. What's really important about this is the aspect that it stayed on the books for over 50 years, and nobody made any kind of demands or changes. Everything was silent. And then in the 1960s in Manitoba, we started to see some changes, right? And particularly that, again, reflects the difference in society and the economy at that point. However, the government once again responded to concerns that were being expressed by the public, by parents, by different groups at that point. And you can see from that quotation that I share with you at the bottom of this page from the Legislative Library Proceedings, because we now have Hansard available to us from 1958 forward. The Minister of Education in 1963 suggested that compulsory school leaving age was a disappearing problem, right? Didn't need to worry about this. This wasn't important. Don't worry about it. What was really discussed within the legislature at that time was that this was just a natural occurrence, right? Is that people were sending their children to school at that point, and children were staying in school to around the age of 16, though. That's an important sort of point to make. So they really didn't need a law. How the government, again, kind of repeated themselves 50 years later. We don't really need a law to do this because this is a natural phenomenon. It's already sort of occurring. So there's two different perspectives in the legislature at that point. And you can see on the left-hand side of my screen, the MLA, Mr. Froese, at that point suggested that, well, we don't think this is our business to do this, right? Even though we feel that business is, again, trying to force us to do this, to make some changes to compulsory education, not really important. It's really about what he suggested is about the hand of the parent. The parents have the right to, in a sense, determine and guide what their children are doing. However, as we can see here on the other side of the, of course, of the legislature at that point, and with the opposition, what they said is that, well, with all the emphasis that is being placed these days by industry and economists and educationalists on the desirability of increased education and the availability of increased education, that this bill, which was an act to amend the School Attendance Act from 1916, is a proper one. So therefore, with much pressure, once again, the government made the revision in 1963, and they increased the compulsory school leaving age to 15. Now, interesting enough, only 2 years later, in 1965, the government once again increased the compulsory school leaving age to 16. So from 1965 until 2011, that's basically what sat on the books in the province of Manitoba. Again, keeping in mind that distinction that I introduced to you at the very beginning today of my presentation, there was a right to attend school. So if I was 6, I could attend school, but I was not required to do so. What was required according to the revision of the Student Attendance Act in 1965 then was that I had to attend school when I reached the age of 7, but I only had to stay in school until I reached the age of 16. Now, there are other conditions that are, again, for purposes of my presentation today, I can't go into all the different clauses and regulations, but there were some opportunity. For example, if a parent wanted their child to leave school before 16, they could do so with, again, the accommodation by the principal of that school. So there are various aspects to that as well. But going forward now, from, of course, 1965 to 2011, as I said, then all of a sudden we saw the government shift focus once again from, again, the student attendance focus to preparing students for success. And this, I would suggest, you kind of build off what Ontario was doing that point in 2005 with their Preparing Students for Success Act. And I just borrowed, if you don't mind, any Ontarians out there, we kind of borrowed a bit from you here to develop this act in 2011. And at that point, as I said previously, Manitoba kind of joined the ranks of increasing the school leaving age to the age of 18, which is a really interesting perspective. And certainly with the note, Mr. Coldwell now, who at that point was the Minister of Education, suggested that an increase in the age of compulsory education should exist to adulthood, which again, the age of majority here in the province of Manitoba is 18. And further, what he suggested is that we, the government, believe that there are benchmarks that have to be satisfied in order to progress through one's school life. Therefore, what they deemed at that point, it was the former administration here in the province of Manitoba, was that a child needed to attend school until they're 18, i.e. until they are an adult or until they graduate school. Now, to conclude my presentation, I just wanted to add one other sort of perspective and thought for your reflection. And again, I'm borrowing from the past once again. In the Winnipeg Free Press of March, as you sort of see here, from March 9th of 1910, the editor of the paper at that point made this comment: "An advancing civilization demanded the passing of compulsory bill. In years to come, the province would be judged by the caliber of its people and by no other standard." Further, I'm going to leave you with a question. I began with a question. I'm going to leave you with a question, if I may. The fair and proper question is, and Mr. Coldwell, the former Minister of Education in the province of Manitoba at that point in 1914, proposed, what would educational conditions have been if those laws had not been on the statute books? Thank you very much. You can see I have a list of my references here, if you're interested in that. And again, I thank you very much for listening to my presentation and for sharing with me my research. Thank you once again, and look forward to answer any questions that you may have. My contact information is also on the screen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ardith, for this informative and interesting walk through compulsory education law in Manitoba. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you have questions, you can type them now if you wish in the Q&A section, and I will come back to them after our next presenter. So I now take this time to introduce Dr. Paul Bennett, who will be talking to us about Postal Code education, schools, household income, and student success. Welcome, Dr. Bennett.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to join you today. I'm very pleased to be part of this series. And this particular project is the result of some research that I conducted recently. And going back this morning, I was thinking it might have been 10 years of research to bring me to this point where I can feel confident about bringing it to you today. Let me share my screen. And so you can see here. Again, thank you for inviting me to be part of this series. I will try to stay within the time to allow some time for you to ask me questions so we can get going with this. Everyone knows that there's a common saying in education, and it's that where you live greatly influences the educational outcomes of your children. People choose to move to certain neighborhoods thinking that the school is better around the corner. And I thought that we should try to test that hypothesis. Where you live is a determining factor in student success. Is that true or not? I think we tend to assume that this little project set out to look at it and to delve into one particular school jurisdiction. So my research report essentially tests the hypothesis and conducts a close the gap initiative analysis of one particular school system, which happens to be Atlantic Canada's largest school system. I'm sure everyone watching today would agree with the statement that no child's future should be determined by their postal code. And I think that the weight of research confirms that it does contribute to inequality in student achievement. How a school district identifies struggling schools and how it responds is crucial, and it actually is what matters. We have a couple of choices. We can accept the socioeconomic dictates, or we can ignore the stark realities of socio and economic differences. Whatever we do, it tends to reinforce the prevailing assumption, contribute to lowered academic expectations, and perhaps even influence school leadership, student behavior standards, teacher attitudes, and parent-school relations. My research is summarized in a report that I compiled and produced for the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. I've gone considerably beyond that, but I thought you might like to look at the original study upon which this is based. We all know that there's an achievement gap, and whether it's income, ethnicity, racial disparities, it does contribute to what is called the achievement gap. Children of affluence and children of poverty live in different worlds, and more often than not are strongly influenced by their socioeconomic status. And it's usually measured in mean household income, which is the way that I've chosen to proceed. Where we live is another factor, and one defined by what is called the postal code, or place of residence. In school systems that maintain strict elementary school attendance zones, your school catchment area can determine the quality of your education. This is what I've termed, and the phrase that I coined myself, postal code education. Why did I choose to study the Halifax school system? Well, I couldn't resist. Not only do I live in Halifax, but there was a project underway over the last 10 years that made it relatively easy to do this assessment. So I took the Halifax Regional Center for Education, formerly the Halifax Regional Board of Education, and I used it as a lens through which to tackle the whole question. And student achievement and attainment results over that decade, from 2008-09 to 2015-16, had been published in school-by-school community reports. And when they were aggregated, provided a clear evidence of how students were actually performing school by school in the Halifax region. I attended the release of the statement, Good Schools to Great Schools, back in 2009, and I followed it right through its progress. This is an example of the superintendent's reports to the community. And if you can believe it, every single one of the 135 schools had a community report which stated how students were doing each year. It was actually distributed in print to everyone, and it was freely available to school advisory councils, posted on the websites of every school. What's significant is most superintendents shy away from any reference to how schools are doing. But look at the way the statement was prepared. Knowing how each school is doing is the first important step in making sure resources and support reach the schools and the students that need them the most. So there was transparency. Just for those of you that are new to Nova Scotia education, we're talking about the Halifax Regional School Board, right in here, which is the largest in the region, which has today around 50,000 students in 135 different schools. I broke down all of the results school by school going over an 8-year period. I'm not the first to do this, and there's quite a bit of controversy, as many of you know, about ranking schools on the basis of student test results. But the critics, of which there are two well-known, Helen Raptis and People for Education, they maintain that in doing so, places undue emphasis on academic achievement, focuses too much on literacy and mathematics, and can have a detrimental effect on chronically low-performing schools. However, defenders of comparing schools contend that education is a public service. Parents have the right to know how their students are performing, and mapping the results on the basis of household family income makes clear that how schools rank in relation to socioeconomic factors. What I've shown you on the right is a study by the Globe and Mail, sponsored by Carolyn Alfonso and Tavia Grant in 2013, where they applied this same basic principle as I have to the Toronto District School Board. And here's a map, which I used in part as inspiration for my project. Why do it? Well, because the information is quick, easy to understand, and helpful in ensuring that parents are better informed on schools or how schools are doing, and they can become more effective advocates for school improvement. Now, as we all know, ranking schools is not an exact science, especially when we're dependent upon publicly accessible provincial and school district data. We need to be cognizant of the limitations of such studies, even when they're presented in their socioeconomic context. Test score rankings do not consider how well schools do on aspects of education beyond the acquisition of academic knowledge and skills. It is, however, and this is an important point, the one publicly accessible and reasonably reliable means of assessing the quality of education in our schools. That was a point made by Carolyn Alfonso and Terry Peskoski, who ranked all the schools in Hamilton in 2014. My purpose was not ranking the schools, it was just the beginning of a process. I wanted to find out whether schools did improve and by how much, in line with the commitment from good to great schools in the Halifax school system. I also signed an agreement with the Halifax Chronicle Herald to publish installments of my research. So it appeared in two forms: as an initial study, Raising the Bar and Closing the Gap, published by the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. And then I convinced our provincial newspaper to do a 4-part series where we excerpted the highlights of this report. And this was, and I wrote every one of the pieces, including reporting on the report and summarizing a whole series of recommendations for reform. I wanted to give you a quick look at the community school reports, and this is what was distributed on an ongoing basis for 5 years. And I had a good look at all of them, and I had copies of all of the detailed school by school reports. So what was interesting about my study was I decided I would meticulously go through all of the reports from 2008 to 2009, right through to 2015-16, 135 schools, roughly 90 elementary. And what I'm showing you today is the elementary school assessments. We broke them down according to the highest performing schools, weighing them against socioeconomic advantages. And take, for example, if you know Halifax, this is the university quadrant here, right around St. Mary's and Dalhousie University. And you'll see that all the top schools are concentrated around the universities or in the higher income areas of Dartmouth on the other side of the harbor. But what's interesting is how strong some of the schools were in their provincial rankings. And I'll move this a little bit over. I think you probably can, the average over here, you can see the average of how many students met the provincial standard. Some of the top schools, this one's right beside Dalhousie. And what's interesting is close proximity to universities is certainly a major determinant here as to how students do. We did take another look at, so that's the highest performing schools. The most struggling or troubled schools, and this is in reading. Before it was math. I did both reading and math. In reading, I thought I'd show you the struggling schools. You'd be shocked to realize that just a little over 1 out of 3 students at the worst performing school can read at the end of grade 6. And going down to the best of this lot, the 12 weakest performing schools, 30% of the students can't read effectively at the end of grade 6 for the most part. I could go into the detail, but I won't. But if you take a look and you look at the 2018 census data, and we weighed the you see where the concentrations are in slightly different areas. And I could go into detail, but I won't. We also had a GIS map, interactive, that went along with all of this. Then the third category was the most improved schools. And here I wrote a whole piece on what separated the schools that were improving the most. And you would expect the answers: gentrification of an area that was previously working class, transfer of a French immersion program. In every case, I was able to analyze a factor or two that explained the improvement. But the truth of the matter is, none of them related to the initiative that was every school will improve that the board had implemented. I also took a look at the impact on high school performance of students, trying to figure out whether the quality of the elementary school had any bearing on the high school. And some of you will know about Pathways to Education, which is a program to assist those kids who are more likely to drop out when they're in grade 8 and 9. And I took a look at the most improved high school, and it turned out to be the one that was in the Spryfield attendance zone, which is served by Pathways to Education. So one of my recommendations was that wraparound programs like Pathways to Education have the potential for changing dramatically how students are doing. Look at the graduation rates in the Spryfield attendance zone under the Pathways to Education program. It went from 54% to 89%, and it was most strongly reflected in the subject of mathematics. So whatever happened to the school improvement plan initiated by the Halifax Regional School Board when it was introduced back in 2008 and 2009? That was the benchmark for the program. It was the benchmark for my study. And I took it right through from 2008, 2009, right through to the target year of 2013, when Carol Olson, shown here, the late Carol Olson, she passed away recently, said all schools would improve and there would be significant improvement. That, of course, didn't happen. What happened was, when it was clear that they were not going to improve, the school board switched to from school by school reporting to system data reporting in 2011, and denied me any access to any of the data after that date, because by then they knew I was doing serious research. So my conclusion, not only that where you live does influence how you do, but that ambitious attempts like good schools to great schools have not worked any miracles. Look at the report in May 2014, which was supposed to be when this project wrapped up. Quote, "A large achievement gap exists between overall board results and those students who live in poverty." And when it was obvious that this was not working, they switched completely the orientation to identifying priority schools, which they said would get more attention, enhanced resources, and extra support. They denied me access to the priority schools. I do have a Freedom of Information request, and I was advised on Monday, believe it or not, this week, that 4 years later, after I started this research, they'd opened a file and they were looking at providing me with the detailed backup on the priority schools project, which succeeded this. The focus changed again in 2017-18, when it became clear that the grade 6 math and literacy results were terrible, especially for kids who came from marginalized and racialized communities. Students of African descent were identified as underperforming, particularly in grade 6 math, where scores dropped 2%, leaving less than half, 49%, meeting provincial standards. So there's more to this than just ranking schools and assessing how they're doing. What's the significance of this study? Because I want to leave ample time for questions, we can dig into it. You have to realize that the Halifax Regional School Board was quite ambitious. They did focus on raising student achievement levels in socioeconomic schools, but it evolved from 2009-10 to 2017-18 into something different. They abandoned school by school improvement and shifted to improving student performance along ethno-racial lines. and the school by school improvement initiative was superseded. And they completely changed everything from closing the socioeconomic gap to culturally responsive teaching and learning. What I learned was that comparing school by school performance over the recent decade runs smack up against socioeconomic inequalities and the reality of postal code education. But it also raises critical questions about why school boards initiate projects that don't work and then shift gears and don't acknowledge that anything has gone wrong, which is essentially what happened here. It was redefined as a question of ethnocultural differences. So raising achievement levels while reducing glaring inequalities is certainly the biggest challenge of all. And I believe I've shown the indication for the need for further research utilizing bigger and larger student populations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paul, for sharing your fascinating research on postal code education in Halifax. And I'm going to open up this time for questions. And if our attendees could please type questions in the Q&A box and we'll work through those. Paul, could you also unshare your screen?
Good idea.
Thank you. So we have our first question for Dr. Plant. I wonder if the federal government has the power to intervene with provincial level policies. For instance, before July 2020, international students who became a permanent resident were not considered as Newfoundland resident because they were not in the province for a year before attending school. Because of that, they could not apply for student aid, as the federal student aid was applied through the province. They could not apply for federal aid either. I wonder if the policy was unlawful and whether the federal government could have intervened if they were aware of it.
That's a very good question, actually. And to be honest with you, I'm not that familiar with that particular issue as it occurred in Newfoundland. But when we get into a discussion of sort of federal provincial relations, particularly within the educational laws and jurisdiction of the provinces, what you typically find is that the federal government is quite hesitant to intervene within provincial jurisdictional matters, such as education. And I know within the province of Manitoba, and I would anticipate in Newfoundland and other provinces as well, that that case would be similar in that again, the provinces kind of reign power over anything education related. And I know within the context of, international students and international, whether it be as the question I think pertains to, tuition or to access to education, most times I know from the experience I've had here in the province of Manitoba, that is something that's even done on a school division level. So for example, there'll be certain divisions that have policies on international students in terms of access, and then the federal government doesn't typically intervene within that context. That's just been my experience. I don't know if that answers the question or not specifically, but I hope it gives you some perspectives anyway.
Thank you. Another question for Dr. Plant. Does the province of Manitoba have a provision for homeschooling in its Education Act?
Yes, there is a provision for homeschooling. Actually, thank you for bringing that to the attention of this presentation, because it's actually a fascinating statistic. Even before COVID, which is of course over 2 years ago, the rate of participation, the option that parents had to homeschool their parents was extremely high in the province of Manitoba. In fact, if you look across Canada at all jurisdictions, the rate of participation of parents choosing homeschooling was the highest in the province of Manitoba. And now going forward, looking at that data again, currently I just looked at the enrollment report as of last fall. That's the most current data that we have available right now in the province. Homeschooling is still considered a very viable option chosen by parents, and more, as I said, continually, even now with the pandemic, more and more parents are choosing homeschooling in Manitoba than any other province or territory in Canada. I can't necessarily, I can make some suggestions as why that's occurring. However, I haven't really done specific research to sort of support that hypothesis, so I would need to, of course, do that. But I will suggest if you do look at the homeschooling numbers, Manitoba is actually an interesting phenomenon in many cases, and that's one of them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Bennett, this one is for you. Paul, thank you for your presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the complete study. Have I located the correct paper, Raising the Bar and Closing the Gap, Schools, Income, and Student Success, Ames policy paper?
Yes, it's on ResearchGate under my name, and that is the correct study. What you heard today, though, was a further elaboration and an updating of that study, which appeared in January of 2019.
Great. And I'm actually going to ask a question, since maybe that'll give other people some time to type theirs in. I was wondering, Paul, if you had in the data that you had access to, if you also had access to parents' highest education levels.
Did not include an analysis of parents' highest education levels. It was strictly an analysis of how students had performed on the provincial tests, and there was reasonable consistency. What's interesting, though, is all the socioeconomic data we recreated. Myself and I worked with Fred Valence Jones at the University of King's College. I took a data analysis course with him on journalism. I have a little certificate in investigative journalism from that course. And I worked with Frank King, who is a GIS specialist, and the two of us coded all the school locations and mapped them against the 2018 census data for mean household income. This was something that the Globe and Mail had done, and I talked to Carolyn Alfonso, and I got an idea of how it was done, and we replicated the methodology in Halifax.
Excellent, thank you. And some more questions have come up. That's great. Paul, can you talk a bit more about your observation that the higher performing schools are often located in the vicinity of universities? What do you think is going on here, and what should school boards be noting about this trend?
I really think that was one of my biggest findings, which was that it was quite obvious that the top performing schools were located the closest to the university sector, and that they were significantly better than the others. The suburb schools I looked at in Bedford, and these are very affluent suburbs. By the way, the highest income area is in Bedford, not around the universities. So while the universities have the highest levels of income in the city proper, they're not the highest levels of income in the overall greater Halifax area. And so there are pockets of very affluent communities where the schools serving them did better. So that's why it's scattered beyond there. But your point is, it would be really a good thing to get is levels of education and proportions of students and levels of education. That would be the next step for this study. Great question. Another thing that's interesting is the most improved schools are, I tried to figure out, was it teaching effectiveness? Was it changes in the neighborhoods? Was it particular programs? And in each case, I bore down and looked at each school that was improved and tried to assess, interviewing people, trying to assess what was the factor. By the way, the stories in the Halifax Chronicle Herald had interviews with people reacting to the findings and contributing to this. And there was quite a bit of interest in pathways to education when this appeared, because there was I put a 1,200 word piece. It covered 2 pages in our provincial newspaper, where I put the suggested lessons and ways we can improve and close the gaps between the richer and the poorer students.
Excellent. I see some more questions here. For Dr. Bennett, your results support the widely held view that school-by-school comparisons are more comparisons of school demographics than of school performance. Yet you seem to still frame the comparisons as reflective of performance. If demographics are really the issue, then aren't system-wide responses more appropriate?
I don't think the system-wide response in Halifax under good schools to great schools supports that at all. I think there was quite a bit of resistance from teachers, lots of dissonance from those who felt they were being tested to a great extent. There was pushback. The parents really, really supported this initiative though, because think of it, they each had a report on how their students were doing. And it was fairly comprehensive too. The problem was it got repetitive because they didn't see enough improvement. You see, I think they realized after they published 3 of them, and there wasn't dramatic improvement, there was some regression, that it was becoming a problem. So it had to be redefined. And with regard to me, there was an organized effort to deny me access to anything as soon as it was clear what I was doing. I got 2 years straight given to me free of data. And once they realized I was actually using it to do detailed analysis, I never got any more. In fact, when I was completing this study, I phoned the superintendent. I told him the stories were coming out in the paper. Would you like me to review all the results? And I said, oh, by the way, you haven't published any school by school results in the last 3 years. And he said, oh, really? And then I thought, uh-oh, they're going to take the ones down that are there. So I quickly spent a full week going through everything that was posted and taking the 2015-16 data and putting it in my grids and working, probably a week's work. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, it was gone. If I hadn't done it, the study would not have appeared.
Wow.
Be vigilant. And
Yep.
and you know what? They kept saying, go freedom of information. Well, yes, would have been another 6 years to complete this study. I honestly, Monday, I got a call saying that the data on the priority schools, which I'd asked for and been denied, they said they had opened a file and they were going to try to get it from the school board. And I said, the problem is the school board's been abolished. Now it's a center for education. School closures are a problem. Surprised nobody's asked me that. What do I do when the schools close and kids shift? Or what do I do when they shift the testing from grade, as they did in math, grade 3 to 4? What do you do? They do things that make it next to impossible to do longitudinal studies of how students are doing.
Okay, we have a couple more questions here. Dr. Bennett, how do schools become schools with lower quality? Are schools funded differently, or is it because good teachers don't want to teach? Sorry, just the question shifted down. Or is it because good teachers don't want to teach in those schools?
Great question. I bore down enough and interviewed enough people to know that teacher turnover is the biggest problem. Leadership, revolving door leadership is a problem. And the proportion of people in those schools that are in renters, and there's a transition in the neighborhood. I also determined that the lowest performing schools in Halifax, the proportion of renters was often between 60 and 75%, which is extremely high here, where there's a lot of home ownership. And there's a clear relationship between the percentage of renters and the struggling nature of students in those schools.
Great, thank you. I see another question here. Dr. Bennett, were there any broader educational policy changes or events in Nova Scotia that would explain the shift in Halifax School Board's policy to advance student achievement in 2017, 2018, if I've remembered that correctly from the attendee?
There are three factors that came into play. One, Carol Olson's term as superintendent of education was up. She actually got promoted to be deputy minister of education on the basis of this project. And then she was let go when the government changed. So leadership changed, and it went from a very proactive, out there superintendent who wanted to be known as making a difference to a very, very quiet, unassuming superintendent. So leadership change. Second change was that there was clearly dissent within the system about the exposure that publishing these results was causing. There's a lot of parents that were demanding to see changes, and I thought every school was going to improve. Where is it? Our school has not improved. So that had to be wrapped up for that reason. And then the third thing was a general shift to what you would call identifying race and ethnicity as a cause of underperformance. And that was a province-wide initiative, but it actually provided cover for the Halifax Regional School Board to shift everything, to go to system-wide analysis, and to conceal, actually, that it was actually the same students, just being categorized differently. And now you won't find any, you would have to spend 10 years to reconstruct all the data school by school. It'd be next to impossible to do this project now.
Okay. I have another couple of questions here. Hi, Paul. In explaining their higher test scores, to what degree do you think that students within the wealthiest postal codes are receiving a better education versus the scores being explained by the general advantages of being wealthy?
There are tremendous, there's a tremendous gap, an achievement gap. And by the way, Halifax, I've studied Calgary, Toronto, and other cities. And to be honest, the areas of poverty in Halifax are more scattered. They're not quite as concentrated. So it's not quite as acute. But if I found in Halifax that there are issues like this and they're dramatic, you can imagine if you were to look at some of these other cities where there's higher concentrations of people that are in lower socioeconomic areas, and they're not as scattered throughout the city. And I've even did some analysis of comparing 5 cities on levels of socioeconomic neighborhoods. By the way, the best research is in the United States, where they are very concerned about segregated neighborhoods according to race and class. And most of the best research is because they confront the reality that there are these differences based on where people live. There's quite a bit of research there on this, not a whole lot here. It's amazing what one article published in CSSE can do to a whole field. As Helen Raptis wrote an article that I know Helen very well, I'm in her association, that it was a bad thing to rank schools, period. So don't do it. Thereafter, nothing. So CSSE is culpable because no one answered that and said, yes, there's so much data. You mean we're going to walk away from it? We're not going to pursue that. We're, why not use it if it's there?
Great. I see. Okay, I'm trying to remember. This is a continuing question from a previous one. So maybe, Paul, maybe you can piece this together, help me. It says, or is it because parents of lower socioeconomic backgrounds and or who are immigrants do not have as much influence on politicians? And I can't remember the previous question that would go with that.
I tried to stay with where my empirical evidence led me. I would be only speculating about that. But I think it's fairly true, though, that there is quite a variation. That's based on socioeconomic status. And I think we know enough now to look at the education levels of parents. Needs to be more thoroughly examined. We also need to look at why some schools improve and others are stagnating, and the detailed factors. I had quite a response from the most improved school because I put them up in lights. I got lots of reaction from parents. And it was quite obvious. I got invited there and everything else. It was quite obvious why it was the most improved school. I walked in there and in 5 minutes I could tell. But why? It was a tone, attitude, feeling of, we want to be here. It was the obvious things. Another most improved school was, there was a scholarship program for graduates of that school to go to college and university. It was a scholarship that had been established 20 years ago. It set the tone for that school. It's in Hubbards, which is outside the general area of Halifax.
Great, thank you. That is all the questions that we have today. I'd like to thank both Dr. Plant and Dr. Bennett for sharing their research with us today, and thank all of you for attending. And Sherry has shared the slide here. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can always contact the Canadian Sociological Association office. And we hope to be continuing these webinars next year. So stay tuned for announcements of some more fascinating presentations in the sociology of education. And we thank you again for attending, and we especially thank our presenters. And there's a lot of thank yous coming in the chat. Paul and Ardith, thanking both of you for your presentations.
Thank you